1943, in the vast and brutal China-Burma-India theater, American airmen had a name for the supply route over the Himalayas. They called it the Hump, but among the transport crews who flew it every day, it had another, far darker nickname, the Aluminum Trail. It earned this name because the route was not marked by radio beacons or maps. It was marked by the sun glinting off the shattered aluminum wreckage of the dozens of C-47 sky trains that had failed to make the journey. They lay scattered in the deep, inaccessible gorges and on the sheer, ice-covered faces of the mountains below, a permanent, metallic monument to the route's lethality. The C-47 Skytrain, the famed Goonie bird, was not a warplane. It was a modified civilian airliner, a workhorse. It was slow, often overloaded with critical supplies and completely unarmed. Its mission, however, was one of the most vital of the entire war, to be the last, fragile artery connecting Allied forces in China with the outside world. To do this, it had to fly from airfields in Assam, India, over the world's tallest and most violent mountain range. This was, without exaggeration, the most dangerous airspace on Earth. The Hump was a geological nightmare, a series of 18,000 to 20,000-foot ridges. It was a place of 150-mile-per-hour jet streams, sudden, invisible downdrafts that could pluck a 10-ton aircraft from the sky, and severe, instantaneous icing that could coat a plane's wings and send it into an unrecoverable stall. This was the enemy, long before a single shot was fired. The official doctrine from the Air Transport Command, ATC, was built on a single, seemingly logical principle: safety through altitude. The orders were absolute. Pilots were to climb to a minimum safe altitude of 22,000 feet, sometimes higher, before crossing the main ridges. This was meant to keep them above the worst of the unpredictable weather and clear of the treacherous, uncharted peaks. It was a rule written by logisticians in headquarters, a rule designed to prevent planes from flying into mountains. But what the ATC considered safe, the Japanese Imperial Army Air Force considered a perfect, open-air hunting ground. At 22,000 feet, a C-47 was a sitting duck. It was slow, struggling in the thin air, and its silver, unpainted skin drew a perfect white contrail against the deep blue sky. It was a target, visible for 50 miles. Patrolling this high-altitude safe route were the Japanese Ki-43 Oscars. The Oscar was a superb high-altitude interceptor, light, fast, agile, and heavily armed. Its pilots, flying from captured airfields in Burma, would simply climb above the aluminum trail, wait for the slow-moving silver silhouettes to appear below them, and then dive, attacking from the sun with impunity. The Goonie birds had no armor, no guns, and nowhere to run. The High Command in India would receive the static-laced radio report, if one came at all: another C-47, lost to weather or failed to report. The statistics were being filed under the wrong enemy. Into this meat grinder came Lieutenant Jack "Ark" Foley. Foley was not a product of West Point. He was not a dashing fighter pilot. He was a 24-year-old from the flatlands of Arkansas, which earned him the call sign Ark. Before the war, Foley had been a crop duster. His entire professional life had been spent flying 50 feet off the ground, dodging power lines, reading the subtle shifts of wind over a field of cotton, and maneuvering his biplane with instinctive, millimeter-perfect precision. He was an expert not in high-altitude meteorology, but in the intimate, chaotic flow of air over terrain. Foley's first flights over the Hump were a terrifying education. He followed the rules. He climbed to 22,000 feet, his engines straining, the airframe vibrating, the cabin temperature dropping to 40 below zero. He watched a C-47 in his own formation, a plane from his own barracks, suddenly and silently explode in a distant orange flash, the victim of an Oscar he never even saw. He made it to Kunming, China, on sheer, blind luck, but as he flew, the crop duster in him was screaming. He knew how to hide an aircraft, and you didn't hide by painting yourself against the sky. As he flew the safe route, he looked down into the terrifying, uncharted chasms and the deep, winding river valleys thousands of feet below. The official doctrine said those valleys were certain death, a place of inescapable downdrafts and sheer rock walls. But Foley, the low-altitude expert, saw something else. He didn't see a death trap. He saw cover. He saw a solution. Lieutenant Jack Foley's second and third flights over the hump were a confirmation of his terror. He followed Doctrine, climbing to the freezing thin air of 22,000 feet. He watched his wingman's plane, Delta Bell, struggle with carburetor icing, lose an engine, and begin a slow, agonizing spiral down into the cloud-filled valleys below. There was no radio call, no parachute, just a disappearance. The official report cited mechanical failure due to severe weather. But Foley knew the ice had only finished what the altitude had started. On his fourth flight, he saw the enemy. Two Ki-43 Oscars, appearing as tiny black specks diving from the sun. They attacked the lead C-47, their cannons flashing. Foley, helpless, could only watch as the transport's wing shredded and it cartwheeled into the void. The Oscars, their work done in less than 20 seconds, climbed back up to their high-altitude patrol route. It was on the return flight, flying an empty, lighter aircraft, that Foley's crop duster instincts finally overrode his military training. He was flying the safe route, but he felt like a tethered goat. He studied the Japanese tactics. The Oscars were like hawks. They hunted from above, using altitude as their primary weapon, scanning the vast, open sky below them. They were predictable. They were expecting their prey to be exactly where Air Transport Command had ordered them to be. The problem, Foley realized, was not the C-47's lack of speed or guns. The problem was the doctrine. The safe 22,000-foot altitude was, in fact, the single most dangerous place he could be. It was the vulture's perspective, the perfect vantage point for a predator. Foley began to think like a crop duster. In Arkansas, if you wanted to avoid a hawk, you didn't fly higher. You flew lower. You put the terrain between you and the threat. You hugged the tree lines, used the hills as a mask, and made yourself invisible against the ground. He looked down from his cockpit at the terrifying labyrinth of canyons and river gorges that formed the aluminum trail. The official doctrine strictly forbade low-altitude flight. It was considered suicide. The weather charts for these valleys were non-existent. The downdrafts and microbursts were powerful enough to rip the wings off a C-47. A single engine failure, a momentary lapse in navigation, and the result was a guaranteed, unsurvivable impact with a cliff face. There was no room to maneuver, no altitude to trade for speed, and no possibility of a bailout. But Foley saw something else. He saw a highway. He saw that if a pilot was skilled enough, or crazy enough, to fly inside those canyons, he would be completely invisible. A Japanese pilot at 25,000 feet would never see a plane flying 20,000 feet below him, masked by the terrain. He would be shielded from Japanese radar, which was useless against targets flying below the mountain ridges. And most importantly, an Oscar diving into a narrow, twisting gorge to chase a C-47 would be committing suicide itself. Its high-speed wings were not designed for that kind of low-speed, high-G maneuvering. The Predator would be forced to abandon the hunt. The official route was a simple straight line on a map, high and exposed. Foley's route was a chaotic, winding scribble, deep and hidden. He began his preparations in secret. He didn't use the standard ATC navigation charts. He spent his off-duty hours studying reconnaissance photos, memorizing the shapes of river bends, the forks of valleys, the distinct profiles of certain peaks. He was creating his own map, one based not on altitude and compass headings, but on pure, unadulterated terrain recognition. He was planning to fly the C-47 not like a transport, but like his old Arkansas biplane. His co-pilot, a 20-year-old second lieutenant named Harris, was fresh from flight school in Texas and believed in the manual. Foley knew Harris would object. He also knew that asking for permission was not an option. He would be grounded or worse, sent for psychiatric evaluation. The ATC was not interested in the theories of a former crop duster. They were interested in following the book. Foley decided that the book was getting men killed. The mission came on November 5, 1943. The cargo was not routine. It was designated Red Ball priority, a full load of plasma, penicillin, and most critically, replacement barrels for the P-40 Warhawk cannons at Kunming, China. The Flying Tigers were down to their last operational fighters, and without these barrels, their air defense would collapse. The weather briefing at the Assam airfield was deceptively perfect. "Severe clear," the meteorologist announced. "Clear skies, minimal wind at altitude." For the ATC command, this meant a fast, efficient flight. For the pilots, it was a death sentence. Severe clear meant visibility was unlimited. It meant the Japanese Oscar patrols would be out in force, and they would see the slow-moving C-47s from 50 miles away. Lieutenant Jack Foley and his co-pilot, Lieutenant Harris, walked to their C-47, the Arkansas Traveler. Harris was visibly nervous, checking the sky. He remarked that it was a beautiful day for flying. Foley merely nodded, his expression grim. He replied that it was a beautiful day for hunting. They climbed into the cockpit, went through the pre-flight checks. The engines turned over, catching with a belch of blue smoke in the humid morning air. Foley taxied to the runway, last in a formation of 3 C-47s. The first 2 transports took off, banked heavily to the east, and began their long, slow, doctrinal climb toward 22,000 feet. Foley's turn came. He pushed the throttles forward, and the Goonie bird lumbered down the steel-planked runway, heavy with fuel and cargo. It lifted off, struggling for altitude. Harris, his hands on the charts, called out the heading for the high-altitude route. "Climb to 22,000, heading 090. Foley nodded, pulling the yoke back, climbing to 1,000 feet. He held it there. The other 2 C-47s were now just specks, thousands of feet above them, beginning their journey to the safe altitude. "Sir, we need to climb," Harris said, his voice tight. Foley didn't answer. Instead, he did the unthinkable. He pushed the yoke forward. The C-47's nose dropped aggressively. Harris, convinced Foley had lost his mind or that the controls had failed, grabbed his own yoke. "Lieutenant, what are you doing?" Foley, his eyes fixed on the terrain ahead, spoke, his voice perfectly calm. "I'm flying, Lieutenant." "You just watch the map," reported Speech. He told Harris he was flying, and that Harris should just watch the map. He descended to 500 feet, then 300, lining the aircraft up with the mouth of the Brahmaputra River gorge. The 2 C-47s above them were now invisible, on their way to the aluminum trail. Foley's transport was alone. He was officially and dangerously off mission. The Arkansas Traveler plunged into the canyon. The transition was terrifying. The world went from an open blue sky to a claustrophobic winding corridor of sheer rock walls. The river boiled just 200 feet below them. The canyon walls were so close that Harris later swore he could see the faces of the monkeys in the trees. This was a different kind of flying. This was not navigation. It was reaction. Foley's entire body was engaged, his hands light on the yoke, his feet dancing on the rudder pedals, feeling the air, tasting it. He wasn't fighting the turbulence. He was using it, riding the updrafts off the canyon walls, anticipating the downdrafts at every bend. For Harris, it was 40 minutes of pure, agonizing terror. He was useless. His charts were useless. His radio was useless, silenced by the towering rock walls. They were completely cut off, their fate entirely in the hands of a pilot who seemed to be inventing a new kind of insanity. But Foley was in his element. This was Arkansas, 10 tons heavier. He was reading the wind off the water, the same way he used to read it over a cotton field. He was making the 10-ton transport behave like a biplane. For 40 minutes they saw nothing but rock, water, and jungle. Then the canyon widened, opening into a high-altitude valley. This was the most dangerous part, the transition. They had to cross a 15,000-foot ridge to reach the next river system. As they began to climb, emerging from the cover of the canyon, Harris scanned the sky. He saw nothing, and then he saw everything. High above them, at 20,000 feet, he saw 2 distant black specks trailing white contrails. The Oscars. They were exactly where they were supposed to be, patrolling the safe route. They were hunting, but they were looking down, scanning the area where the C-47s should have been. They never once looked 5,000 feet below them at the C-47 climbing out of a canyon. Foley and Harris slipped over the ridge, completely unseen, and dove back into the next valley system. They had just bypassed the entire Japanese air defense. For nearly 2 hours, Lieutenant Foley piloted the Arkansas Traveler through the labyrinth. The tension in the cockpit, which had been thick enough to cut, slowly began to ease. The co-pilot, Harris, had stopped clutching his charts and was now watching the terrain with a mixture of terror and awe. Foley's ARC's route was working. They had seen no Japanese aircraft, and the C-47's engines droned on reliably. The greatest danger, it seemed, was the rock walls that flashed by their wingtips. But the route was not, and could not be, a continuous canyon. To reach Kunming, they had to cross a series of high exposed plateaus, wide river basins that offered no cover. It was during the crossing of the Salween River Valley, a vast, 30-mile-wide expanse of open air, that their luck ran out. High above, at 24,000 feet, Sergeant Kenta Watanabe of the 50th Sentai was on a lone wolf hunt. Watanabe was an ace, with 8 kills, and he had grown bored of the high-altitude patrol. He knew that sometimes American transports got lost or damaged and would try to sneak home through the valleys. He was scanning the ground, not the sky, looking for exactly this kind of prey. He didn't see the C-47. He saw its shadow. A tiny dark shape moving too fast to be a truck, too steady to be a cloud. He rolled his Ki-43 Oscar over and dove, the sun at his back. Inside the C-47, Harris was the first to see it. A black speck, growing rapidly, detaching itself from the sun. He didn't even have time to be a navigator. He just pointed, his voice cracking as he shouted a single word. "Oscar, 6 o'clock high." Foley didn't need to look. He jammed the throttles to the firewall and shoved the yoke forward, diving the heavy transport toward the riverbed, trying to get back to the terrain. But it was too late. The valley was too wide. The Oscar was too fast. Watanabe in his cockpit smiled. This was not a hunt. It was an execution. He was now 400 yards behind the lumbering C-47, matching its speed, closing the distance at his leisure. The American pilot was jinking left and right, a pathetic, useless maneuver in a plane that slow. Watanabe patiently lined up his sights on the C-47's right engine. Foley knew he was trapped. He was in a bus, being hunted by a shark. He couldn't outrun him. He couldn't outturn him. And the canyon walls ahead were still 2 minutes away. He had 2 minutes to live. Harris was bracing for impact, reciting a prayer. But Foley was not praying. He was calculating. His mind went back to the cotton fields of Arkansas, to a hot summer day when his engine had sputtered. He remembered the feel of the spray, the smell of the chemicals, the way the wind caught the mist. He had an idea. It was a desperate, insane crop duster's idea. The Oscar was now at 300 yards. Watanabe's hand was on his trigger, his sights steady on the C-47's engine. Foley turned to his terrified co-pilot and, in a voice that was perfectly calm, gave a 2-word order. The only direct dialogue Harris would remember from the entire flight. "Hit the dumps." Harris stared, uncomprehending. "Sir?" "The emergency fuel dump valves," Foley clarified, his voice still level, never taking his eyes off the canyon wall ahead. "Both of them. Now." Harris, now operating on pure, reflexive obedience, grabbed the 2 red T-handles marked fuel dump and pulled them hard. The effect was instantaneous and violent. From 2 vents in the trailing edge of the wings, a massive pressurized plume of 100-octane aviation fuel erupted, atomizing in the C-47's prop wash. In a fraction of a second, the 10-ton aircraft vanished inside a dense, white cloud of its own making. For Sergeant Watanabe and the Oscar, the world disappeared. He was flying at 300 miles per hour, seconds from firing, when his target was simply erased. He plunged directly into the atomized fog. His windscreen was instantly and completely coated in a sticky, volatile sheet of fuel. He was flying completely blind. He couldn't see the C-47. He couldn't see the river. He couldn't see the fast-approaching granite wall of the next canyon. An overpowering, gagging stench of raw fuel filled his cockpit. And then a new, far more primal terror struck him. His own engine was inhaling a super-rich, explosive mixture of air and raw fuel vapor. His hot exhaust manifolds or a single spark from his own guns could ignite this cloud and vaporize his own aircraft in a catastrophic fireball. Watanabe was no longer a hunter. He was a man trapped in a gas-filled room, blindfolded, with a lit match. He did the only thing he could. He forgot the C-47. He cut his throttle and yanked his stick back in a violent, desperate climb, clawing for altitude, praying to get out of the flammable fog before his engine exploded. He broke free at 15,000 feet, his aircraft sputtering, his heart pounding. By the time he cleared his windscreen and looked back down, the valley was empty. The Arkansas traveler was gone. Foley had not waited to see if his trick worked. The moment the fuel sprayed, he had pushed the C-47's nose down, diving the last 100 feet to the river, and vanished into the mouth of the next narrow gorge. The Oscar, still climbing, never saw him again. 3 hours later, the Arkansas Traveler, its tanks perilously empty, landed at Kunming. The critical cargo of penicillin and cannon barrels was unloaded before the engines had even cooled. Harris was silent, his hands shaking. Foley just signed the fuel report, knowing it would be impossible to explain. When Lieutenant Foley's C-47, the Arkansas Traveler, touched down at Kunming, the mission was, by any objective measure, a success. The critical cargo of penicillin and P-40 cannon barrels was intact. The crew was alive. But for the Air Transport Command operations officer who met the plane, the mission was a logistical and regulatory nightmare. The first discrepancy was the flight log. Foley's C-47 had completed the journey from Assam in a time that was, according to official high-altitude charts, impossible. It was nearly an hour faster than the fastest recorded time. The second, more alarming discrepancy was the fuel report. The aircraft had consumed nearly 400 gallons more fuel than a standard C-47 crossing. The numbers did not add up. Foley and his visibly shaken co-pilot, Harris, were immediately escorted to a debriefing hut. The operations officer, a captain who had never flown the hump himself, demanded an explanation. Foley, remaining perfectly calm, began his report. He stated they had encountered unexpected severe turbulence at 18,000 feet, which forced them to seek a lower altitude. The operations officer countered that no other flight had reported such turbulence. Then came the matter of the fuel. Foley attributed the massive loss to a stuck emergency dump valve, which he claimed had vented fuel for several minutes before he could get it sealed. The captain looked at him with open disbelief. A stuck valve was plausible. A stuck valve that perfectly coincided with an impossibly fast flight time was not. He informed Foley that wasting government property, in this case, 100-octane aviation fuel that was more precious than gold in the CBI theater, was a court-martial offense. Foley and Harris were officially grounded, their flight status pending review by the command back in India. They were, in effect, under suspicion of gross negligence, or worse, cowardice. The official investigation, however, could not compete with the unofficial one. That evening, in the primitive smoke-filled bamboo hut that served as the Kunming Officers' Club, Lieutenant Harris was drinking. He was not celebrating. He was trying to calm his nerves. He was surrounded by other transport pilots, cynical, exhausted men who had all lost friends to the aluminum trail. A veteran flight leader, a major named Red Callan who had been flying the hump since '42, asked Harris why he was grounded. Harris, his hands still shaking, recounted the official story of the stuck valve. Callan, who had seen every way a C-47 could fail, just stared at him. He told Harris that it was a terrible story and that he should try again. Harris, looking at the faces of men who understood the daily terror of the route, finally broke. He told them everything. He told them about Foley ignoring the order to climb, about the terrifying dive into the Brahmaputra Gorge. He described flying below the ridges, the canyon walls so close he could see the branches on the trees. And then he told them about the Oscar, the trap, and the Himalayan cigarette. The bar fell silent. The pilots looked at Harris not as if he were a liar, but as if he were a madman. What he was describing was not flying. It was a suicidal stunt. Major Callan turned to Foley, who had been sitting alone in a corner. Callan walked over, sat down, and quietly asked if the story was true. Foley did not respond with a story. He responded like an engineer. He pulled out his marked-up reconnaissance photos. He didn't talk about bravery. He talked about physics. He explained the downdrafts at the bends, the updrafts on the sun-facing walls. He explained the Japanese patrol patterns, how they were entirely altitude-dependent. He explained, as a crop duster would, that the river valleys, while dangerous, were predictable. The open sky, he argued, was not. Callan, a man who had lost 12 pilots in 6 months, recognized the truth. It was a truth born not of regulation, but of observation. He asked for the maps. The next day, Major Callan and his own co-pilot, citing an engine shakedown flight, took their C-47 up. They did not climb to 22,000 feet. They dove into the gorge. They returned 2 hours later, their faces pale, but their flight log showing no enemy contact. Callan's only comment to his operations officer was that the flight had been routine. The ARC's route, as it was immediately nicknamed, began to spread. It was not a directive. It was a whisper. A clandestine piece of shared knowledge passed from one veteran crew to another. It was a pilot's secret, a rejection of the official doctrine that was killing them. New pilots were still ordered to fly the high-altitude route. But the experienced crews, the ones who knew the real risks, started disappearing from the high-altitude formations. Japanese reports from the 50th Sentai began to note a confusing new trend. Their reliable C-47 hunts were yielding fewer and fewer targets. The skies at 22,000 feet were often empty. Yet, supply tonnage in Kunming was, paradoxically, increasing. Transports were getting through, but they were simply not seen. The Himalayan cigarette tactic was also verified. 2 weeks later, another C-47 crew using ARC's route was ambushed by a Ki-43 that had gotten lucky. The pilot, remembering Harris's story, dumped his fuel. The Japanese pilot, just as Watanabe had, broke off the attack in terror. The C-47 escaped. The tactic was sound. Back in India, the command headquarters was baffled by the data. Fuel consumption logs for certain veteran crews were suddenly erratic and inexplicably high. Flight times were inconsistent. They issued a new stern directive, reminding all pilots that non-standard flight procedures and deviation from approved altitude were forbidden and would be met with severe disciplinary action. Foley's official review concluded. The operations officer in Kunming, unable to prove willful disobedience, could only make the charge of negligence stick. Lieutenant Foley was formally reprimanded for the negligent loss of government property due to an unresolved mechanical failure. It was a black mark on his record. He never received a medal for the Kunming flight. His name was never mentioned in an official report, other than the one that censured him. But in the smoky pilots' clubs of Assam and the debriefing huts in Kunming, his legacy was cemented. The aluminum trail still claimed lives, but the pilots who flew ARC's route had a fighting chance. They were trading the safe and predictable danger of the Oscars for the chaotic, but survivable danger of the terrain. Foley's contribution was not a new piece of technology, like McKenna's wire or a physical defense, like Russo's shield. His contribution was a map that showed the official route to survival was a lie, and that the only true path was one of defiance, hidden 20,000 feet below. If you found this story of ingenuity and defiance as powerful as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It's the best way to help us share these forgotten histories. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Each one of these soldiers, from the mechanics to the pilots, deserves to be remembered, and we want to hear from you. Leave a comment below and tell us what you think. Do you know a similar story of battlefield innovation? Thank you for watching and for helping to keep these voices alive.